See. I think we're recording. Okay. Hi, Amanda.
Oh, hello, Natasha. How are you?
Good. Thank you. And thanks for agreeing to do this interview with me. And thanks also for being a judge on the Redwood Writers Young Adult and Middle Grade Fiction Contest. So,
I'm really looking forward to it.
Tell me a little bit about how you got into writing The Lost Cow, which is your middle grade story, and also what some of the challenges are that you faced with writing that book.
Oh, well, the book came about because I'd actually been talking to two friends who are emergency room doctors, and they had told me about how busy they had been one night, and that had really stuck with me. And it was, I'd thought about it and thought about it, and it was literally 5 years later. I was driving over the bridge in Corte Madera, stopped at the traffic lights, and suddenly this idea came into my head, and I literally wrote it down on the back of an envelope while I was waiting for the light to change. So that it took 5 years of germination, but it really was coming out of that one initial conversation. And I worked on it for about a year before it was then submitted and so on. But I really loved the story. It really spoke to me. But I actually became quite worried that it wasn't my story, because I was writing about Vietnam vets and about Iraq vets. And part of me was worried that actually this was not a story that I should be telling, because I do not have direct contact with veterans myself from those particular wars. But then I realized that this was speaking to me a lot, because I do come from a military family, and that in fact, I was really talking about the stories that had come through my family, through the First World War, through the Second World War, through my father being in the military for a short while. And so it was my story. It was, I really had to be bold enough to recognize that these were stories that had been told to me in childhood, and I was drawing upon my relationship with veterans of other wars, from my village and from my family, and from all the stories that were told by my parents, of course, who were children during the Second World War. So it was my story, because it had affected me, and what I was interested in was the way that people returning from war, no matter what generation, no matter what war, how they're affected and how this affects their families. I think we have to write from the heart and from our own experience as well. And we do make assumptions. And I do see this a lot, particularly obviously in literature that I know about England, and then people writing about England, and they do make assumptions which they don't even recognize that they've made that assumption. Right. So they just believe that they're right because they feel it must be. And I think we have to be very careful to research even the things we think we know. So for example, there are no skunks in England. There's no blown heating. There's all sorts of things that I see on a constant basis when I'm reading books about England that have been written by people who have not lived there, where they assume so much that they don't even think to research it. And that's a real challenge for all of us. You have to research everything, even the things you think you know.
So give me your 5 top tips for writing middle grade.
Well, I think one of the first things that you have to remember with middle grade is not to be afraid of dealing with difficult things. Middle grade is where I would say that middle grade is that point where children are really looking for the heart of everything. They really want to know the big things, the right and wrong. What's right and wrong? What does family mean? What does belonging mean? What does home mean? What's being nice to somebody? What does that really mean? Who do we include? Who don't we? They're really looking at the very big issues. And they really want to know what those are about. So don't be afraid of big issues, but you have to remember that middle grade ultimately is about home. It's about friendship. The middle grade child in a book returns home. YA, you are moving away from home. Middle grade, are trying to move back in and create a really perfect home in some way. So I would say that's one of the big things. The second thing is to remember that the child needs to be the active person within the story. They need to be the one that's driving it. They need to have wants, and they need to have agency. So if you have a middle grade where the parents are constantly coming in and helping out, where the adults solve the problem, then you are not allowing your middle grade reader to really experiment with going out of the home and going out into the world, learning by themselves, and then coming back with that safety, that sense of safety and achievement. Because middle grade kids really want to feel that they are testing whether they can be successful in the world, whether they can actually succeed in the world. That's what they're wanting to do. They want to feel that sense of success because they don't have much chance as younger kids to have to be independent, but they can read that within a book. And so you mustn't let the adults do stuff for them. Let them do it themselves in the book. I mean, obviously you have to keep the pace going. As a writer for middle grade, I think the hardest thing for me, and I think for a lot of people, is to recognize that we are giving this book, this story, to our readers, and we have to be very gracious about it, because we want them to love it. I want my middle grade reader to turn the pages. I want them just to be immersed in that book. You are there to serve the reader and to serve the story, and you can't let your own love of your own writing get in the way of that.
Some people may not know, I just realized, what defines middle grade. So can you just explain that a little bit? What defines a middle grade story?
Yeah, sure. I think we have to be really aware that in children's publishing, there are very accepted genres. And as a debut, particularly author, you really do need to fit into those, unless you have just written the most standout, amazing book ever. We do need to be aware of those, because that's where everything sits in the bookshelves. That's where everything sits at school. You have to be very aware of it. So middle grade is for 8 to 12-year-olds. So we're looking at a group of kids who by now generally can read well. Not always, some will still be beginners, but generally children who are pretty sound in their reading, but we are not looking at moving into that 12 above area where we would potentially be looking at, sex and drugs and rock and roll is how we kind of put it, but stuff that are a little bit too much for a 12-year-old reader.
So what are some of the tips that you might have for people wanting to submit a story to the contest?
Well, I'm going to be really obvious, first of all, which is, of course, hopefully the person has read the guidelines properly. That does mean if it's 10 pages, it really does mean 10 pages. And so, you have to look upon your submission sort of as you would if you were reading in public. And when you're reading, sometimes you will cut stuff out for that reading. Shorter is better. Getting to the point is always better. And so if you have to submit 10 pages, it may be that for that submission, you're going to cut out a couple of paragraphs that you're not going to miss, the reader is not going to miss for those first 10 pages, but will make sure that you get to everything you need to on those 10 pages. So be prepared to change your writing for the submission to make sure you're only sticking to those 10 pages. Within middle grade, I think we always need to have a very clear view of what the child wants right from the very start. What is leading them in the direction of the story? What is it they want? And even an indication of what they really need. And so that we have a real sense of there being a storyline, something driving. There's a spine. Even in the very first 10 pages, we have an idea of what this child wants. I think that's very important because that really keeps us going. And not to do, I would say not to do fake or because I do this a lot, like fake excitement. to keep the reader going. It really has to be intrinsic to that story, that the reason that we want to keep reading is a real reason. It's not been inflated action or inflated emotions just to make it sound good.
Well, thank you, Amanda. I think that's all we have time for.
Yeah, well, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to be a judge. I'm really looking forward to it. And also thank you very much to the people who are submitting, because it's a big thing when you submit your work. And we really do appreciate it. And we will, we appreciate them being entrusted in our care for this short amount of time.